He thought he was hiring a bricklayer, but he was inviting a stranger into his home who knew more about his daughter's blindness than any doctor ever had. What happens next will uncover a multi-million-dollar medical conspiracy, expose a hidden network of abuse, and force one father to decide. Will he protect his legacy or fight for his daughter's future? Wealthy real estate mogul Jackson Whitmore stood rigid in the shadows of his sun-drenched terrace, his eyes locked on a scene unfolding just beyond the marble columns of his Palm Springs estate. In the middle of the vibrant, newly landscaped garden, a tall black man in faded work clothes gently fed spoonfuls of soup to a young girl seated beside the flower bed. His weathered hands, more familiar with bricks and mortar than cutlery, moved with remarkable gentleness. "Just one more bite, sweetheart," the man said warmly, his voice low but affectionate. The girl Elena, Jackson's 8-year-old daughter, smiled. A real smile. The kind he hadn't seen since the accident. It felt like a needle twisting in his chest. Elena had gone blind 2 years earlier in a crash that shattered their world. A drunk driver had slammed into their SUV on a winding canyon road. Elena lost her vision. Jackson had walked away with only bruises and a mountain of guilt. He had been driving. Since then, he'd buried himself in work, unable to face his daughter's blank eyes or his own shame. The staff handled everything: tutors, nurses, therapists. Jackson's presence was a ghost in his own home. But now, watching from a distance, he saw something that shook him to his core. The man's name was Mason Reeves, a contractor hired to renovate the estate's garden. Jackson barely recalled approving the contract. It had been one of many tasks delegated to his assistant. Mason had been working on the grounds for a couple of weeks. What Jackson hadn't known was that he'd also been sitting with Elena in the afternoons, describing the garden's layout, letting her feel different leaves and petals, and today feeding her lunch with a tenderness that felt out of place for someone just doing a job. "Tell me about the colors again," Elena said, reaching up and brushing Mason's cheek, accurately finding his face with her fingertips. Mason chuckled softly. "All right. The roses over there are red like the warmth of a sunset. And the sky's blue today, bright as the ocean you love." Jackson stepped further back into the shadow of the terrace, the guilt rising like bile in his throat. His own daughter, the light of his life, was reaching for connection from a stranger, something he hadn't been able to give her in years. How was it possible that this man, who had only known Elena for a matter of days, could spark joy in her heart again? Could make her laugh? Smile? He turned away as if stung. Inside, the sound of his housekeeper's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Whitmore, sir. You have a call from Tokyo. Something urgent about the Yokohama contract." Jackson nodded, but his mind lingered on the garden, on the girl who used to dance in the sun, on the stranger who somehow saw her more clearly than her own father ever could. He didn't know it yet, but that moment in the garden had just changed everything. Later that night, with the desert wind whispering through the palm trees outside his bedroom window, Jackson Whitmore sat upright in bed, restless and haunted. He hadn't been able to shake the image of Mason Reeves sitting with Elena in the garden, her face illuminated by joy, her laughter soft and unburdened. Unable to sleep, he wandered downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. But as he approached the patio doors, he froze. Through the moonlit glass, he saw them again, Mason and Elena seated near the edge of the fountain beneath the trellis wrapped in jasmine vines. Elena's small hands ran along the stone edge as Mason leaned in beside her, their conversation hushed but clear in the quiet desert night. "My dad doesn't love me anymore since I went blind," Elena said, her voice small but steady. Jackson's heart clenched. He stepped closer, hiding behind the curtains, unable to look away. "That's not true," Mason replied, calm and gentle. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to handle pain, especially when it's someone they love." "Did you lose someone too?" Elena asked. There was a pause, long and heavy. "Yes," Mason finally said. "My daughter, Zoe. She was almost your age. We fought hard, but she passed away from cancer. Leukemia." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known. He had assumed Mason was just another worker, another man hired to lay bricks and build pathways. But now, Jackson heard something deeper: pain, resilience, and a hard-won wisdom wrapped in every word. "What I learned, Elena," Mason continued, "is that time with the people we love is too precious to waste being afraid, even when it hurts." Jackson staggered backward from the door, stunned by the truth he had just witnessed. It wasn't pity that drove Mason's kindness, it was shared grief. Somehow, this man who had lost everything was still able to show up for someone else's child. Meanwhile, Jackson had been hiding upstairs for 2 years, paralyzed by guilt. The next morning, he made a quiet call from his office. Give me everything you can find on a Mason Reeves. I want background, education, work history, everything, he instructed his investigator, pacing before the window. And make it discreet. He hung up and turned his gaze back to the garden, where Mason was gently guiding Elena's hand across the textured bark of a fig tree, helping her identify it by touch. Jackson narrowed his eyes. Who was this man, really? 3 days later, the envelope arrived thick, sealed, and marked confidential. With shaking hands, Jackson opened it and scanned the contents. Mason Reeves, age 43. Bachelor's degree in civil engineering, summa cum laude. Widower. Daughter deceased at age 7. Left a high-paying firm after her death. Now working independently in construction and horticulture. Jackson sat back in his leather chair, stunned. Mason wasn't just a bricklayer. He was a broken man trying to rebuild himself with bricks, with gardens, and now with his daughter. The next morning, something happened at the Whitmore estate that hadn't occurred in over 2 years. Jackson Whitmore canceled all 3 of his business meetings. Instead of boarding his private jet to New York or dialing into a Tokyo conference, he sat at the breakfast table, waiting. When Elena came down with her cane in hand, guided by the housekeeper, her steps halted. "Dad," she whispered, her face cautious, confused. "I was thinking," Jackson said, trying to hide the tremble in his voice, "maybe we could have a picnic today." In the garden. There was a long pause. Then, a small, radiant smile slowly spread across Elena's face. "Really? Aren't you too busy?" That innocent question sliced through him. But he smiled anyway. Not today. They spent the morning awkwardly navigating conversation and silence, sitting on a checkered blanket near the corner of the garden where Mason was carefully laying decorative stones. Jackson tried to pretend he was relaxed, but he couldn't stop glancing toward the man who had somehow reached his daughter's heart. When Mason approached to gather tools nearby, he slowed as he recognized Elena's voice. "Mason," she called out. "My dad's with me today. You should come meet him." The 2 men exchanged a long, quiet look thick with meanings neither could articulate. Mason gave a polite nod. Jackson, ever the alpha executive, managed a stiff handshake. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm settled into their days. Jackson observed more than he engaged, watching as Mason patiently transformed the garden into a sensory haven for Elena. He taught her to recognize plants by scent and texture, to navigate stones by sound, to understand color through emotion. "This one's yellow, like laughter," Mason said one afternoon as Elena touched a marigold. Jackson heard it from his office window. That line haunted him. Late one evening, after tucking Elena in, Jackson sat alone in his study when his assistant walked in, holding a thick manila envelope. "This came anonymously, sir. No return address. Just this." Inside, he found a medical file and a short, typed note. "You need to know the truth about the doctor who treated your daughter." Jackson's hands began to shake as he flipped through the documents. Dr. Charles Bennett, the neurologist who had diagnosed Elena's condition as permanent, had a long, well-hidden history. There were malpractice suits, sealed settlements, and internal memos from hospitals quietly transferring him after patient complaints. But one name leapt off the page. Zoe Reeves, misdiagnosed leukemia. The envelope slipped from Jackson's fingers and fell to the floor. The pieces began to connect. Mason, Zoe, Elena, Dr. Bennett. What if the diagnosis wasn't final? What if Elena's blindness could have been treated but was missed, or worse, ignored? And then, a darker question crept into Jackson's mind. What if Mason Reeves wasn't in this garden by chance? That night, Jackson didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind was a storm of suspicion and guilt, crashing between images of Mason's soft-spoken wisdom and the alarming details in the anonymous medical file. Had this man earned his daughter's trust as a fatherly figure, or as a calculated move to get close? And if so, why? The following afternoon, while Mason and Elena were in the garden, Jackson gave strict orders to his staff to cancel all meetings. When Elena finally went to bed, he asked Mason to meet him in the study. Mason arrived wearing the same simple work shirt, now dusty from a day's labor. His posture was straight, but his face was unreadable. There was no pretense as he walked in only quiet gravity. Before Jackson could speak, Mason pulled a folder from under his arm and placed it on the desk. "I believe you already received similar information," he said, voice calm but firm. "I sent the first envelope. I needed to know if you were alert enough to understand what's happening." Jackson's jaw clenched. "What exactly is happening, Mr. Reeves?" Mason opened the folder and slid a photo forward. His daughter, Zoe, no older than Elena, with bright eyes and a wide grin. Dr. Bennett is not just incompetent. He's dangerous. He's misdiagnosed patients intentionally. My Zoe was told she had leukemia. She didn't. She had a treatable autoimmune disorder. But by the time we figured it out, it was too late. Jackson's face hardened. Why not go to the police? I did, Mason replied, his eyes flashing with pain. But Bennett's protected. His connections run deep: private donors, powerful hospitals, politicians. Every time I tried to expose him, I was shut down, silenced. So you got close to my daughter, Jackson said, his voice sharp now, to manipulate me? No, Mason replied, his voice rising for the first time. I got hired to renovate a garden. I stayed because Elena reminded me of Zoe. Not just because of what they suffered, but because of what they still deserve. The truth. Jackson said nothing. His gaze was cold, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. I'm not asking for your trust, Mason continued, pulling out another document. I'm asking you to read this. He slid over a report signed by Dr. Elisa Winters, an ocular neurology specialist in Santa Barbara. She reviewed Elena's records. The damage from the accident may not be permanent. There's a treatment. Jackson froze. The ground shifted beneath him. He had spent 2 years believing there was no hope. And now, a bricklayer no. A father stood in front of him offering a second chance. Why tell me this now? Jackson finally asked. Because Elena deserves it. And because Bennett hasn't stopped. There are other children. I think he's about to start something new. If we don't stop him, more families will be destroyed. For the first time, Jackson didn't see a worker. He saw a man who had lost everything and still chose to fight for someone else's child. By morning, a plan had already begun to take form, an alliance neither man had expected, but both were now committed to. Jackson Whitmore made the first move. He reached out to his personal legal team, instructing them to conduct a deep investigation into Dr. Charles Bennett. I want every transfer, every lawsuit, every dollar that's ever touched his account, he ordered with cold precision. And find out who's protecting him. Meanwhile, Mason provided names: families he had met during his own heartbreaking journey, parents who had received the same rushed diagnosis, some of whom had buried their children, others still waiting for answers. Each file was a small flame of pain and potential justice. The following day, under the guise of a family wellness trip, Jackson took Elena to see Dr. Elisa Winters in Santa Barbara. The clinic was quiet, discreet, and far removed from Bennett's shadow. Dr. Winters spent nearly 2 hours conducting a detailed examination, softly guiding Elena through each step with the grace of someone who genuinely cared. Jackson waited outside the exam room, sitting rigid, hands clenched, not daring to hope. When Dr. Winters finally emerged, her expression was serious but not hopeless. There is trauma, she said carefully, but it's not irreversible. The optic nerve is damaged, yes, but not beyond repair. With the right therapy and surgical intervention, there's a strong chance Elena could regain partial if not full sight. Jackson exhaled sharply, his knees buckling slightly. He steadied himself against the wall. So, the diagnosis was wrong? Dr. Winters nodded. Or deliberately falsified. Back at the estate, as Elena rested, Jackson stood outside watching the garden bathed in golden light. Mason joined him, silent for a long moment before asking, "How did it go?" Jackson turned toward him, a fire rekindled in his eyes. "We're going to expose him. And not just for Elena or Zoe. For every single child he's harmed." In the days that followed, the two men operated like soldiers in a silent war. Mason compiled research medical files, personal accounts, timelines. Jackson deployed his contacts: journalists, investigators, even a tech firm to trace digital correspondence linking Bennett to corrupt donors and experimental drug companies. Then came the moment of truth. Bennett was arrested during his shift at a prestigious Los Angeles hospital. The news exploded across media platforms, renowned neurologists accused of medical fraud involving dozens of children. The courtroom was packed during the first hearing. Mason sat in the back row, silent. Jackson sat beside him, his hand resting protectively on Elena's shoulder. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the chamber. This is not just a case of misjudgment. This is systemic abuse, betrayal of trust, and the theft of lives that could have been saved. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Whitmore, how did you discover the fraud?" Jackson looked down at his daughter, who was now gently turning her head toward voices, her eyes tracking movement. "The truth finds strange ways of surfacing," he said. "Sometimes it walks in through the garden gate." 3 months later, under the clear blue skies of Southern California, a new chapter was born on a quiet street near Pasadena. Where an old warehouse once stood, now rose the Zoe Foundation, a sleek, sun-filled facility dedicated to treating children who had been misdiagnosed or neglected by the healthcare system. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Elena Whitmore stood in the front row, wearing sunglasses not to hide her blindness, but to ease her sensitivity to the light. Her vision had begun to return slowly, uncertainly, but enough that she now reached for her father's hand without hesitation. Jackson stood beside her, with Mason Reeves on the other side. The three were no longer strangers but a strange, beautiful patchwork of family. "We didn't just want justice," Mason said during his speech, his voice steady but thick with meaning. "We wanted to take our pain and build something that would keep other families from living the nightmare we did." The foundation, backed by Jackson's fortune and Mason's purpose, had already taken in 15 children by its opening day. All had once been declared hopeless. Now, they were beginning to see again, some literally, others emotionally. Dr. Elisa Winters, now the medical director, had adapted Bennett's original protocol into something ethical, effective, and transparent. Ironically, the very research that had once caused such harm was now saving lives, thanks to integrity and care. News of the case had sparked a national reckoning. Hospitals that once partnered with Bennett now faced multimillion-dollar lawsuits. Doctors who had looked the other way were suspended, investigated, or indicted. Whistleblowers emerged. The system that had protected silence was collapsing under the weight of truth. Montgomery Developments, once purely a luxury real estate empire, underwent a transformation as well. Under Jackson's leadership, 30% of its projects were redirected to building pediatric medical centers, family housing near treatment facilities, and sensory gardens like the one where this entire journey had begun. In a rare interview, Jackson spoke plainly. "My daughter helped me see again, not just through her eyes, but through her resilience. I thought I was living. I wasn't. I was hiding behind my own success." One afternoon, Jackson found Mason quietly sitting in the Zoe Foundation garden, watching a new group of children plant flowers. "She would have been 11 this year," Mason said without looking up. Jackson nodded. "Do you think we did her justice?" Mason paused. Revenge would have been taking Bennett down and stopping there. But this? Helping others? This is justice. They sat in silence as laughter filled the air. That week, a new patient arrived, Emma Wilson, 7 years old, blind and afraid. Her parents had given up hope until they heard about Zoe's story. 1 month later, Emma could identify colors. 2 months later, she saw her mother's face again. At Elena's birthday celebration, she stood beside Emma and other children, now smiling, seeing, living. There, etched into the stone entrance of the garden, were the words, "In memory of Zoe Reeves, who taught us to see beyond appearances." Sometimes family isn't who you're born to, it's who you fight beside. And sometimes, healing starts with a stranger in your garden who teaches you how to see again. This story is more than just a tale of redemption and justice. It's a mirror held up to every one of us. It reminds us that real wealth isn't measured in dollars or square footage, but in our ability to show up for the people we love, to fight for what's right, and to listen when others are too afraid to speak. Sometimes, the person who teaches us the most isn't a doctor, a leader, or a billionaire, but someone who has suffered deeply and still chooses to build, to love, to protect. Never underestimate the quiet voices. Mason was just a bricklayer, but behind his rough hands was a heart full of purpose. He turned grief into action, and action into change. And Jackson? He thought he had everything until he realized he had lost the one thing that truly mattered: connection. But when those two men united, they changed lives, not just Elena's, but the lives of dozens of children who now see light because someone dared to fight back. The truth? Justice starts with awareness. Healing starts with courage. And transformation starts with listening. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes the way Elena's were reopened, then don't scroll away. Subscribe to the channel. Like the video. Drop a comment below telling us, what would you have done in Jackson's shoes? And most importantly, share this story with someone who needs to believe that second chances are real and that no pain is ever wasted when it's turned into purpose. Let's build a community that sees beyond appearances and fights for those who can't fight alone. Because sometimes we have to lose everything to finally see what matters most.